Hey everyone, Kate here. I'm super excited to have my second live stream on LinkedIn. Thank you again, LinkedIn, for letting me beta test this awesome feature. I have a guest with me today, Michael Ivie, who is the head of financial services consulting at Phyton. So, Michael, thank you for joining us today on this live show. How about you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely, happy to be here, Kate. I've been with Phyton for the last 3 years. I lead the financial services consulting group. We focus on risk, regulatory, and data management programs for many of our clients, which are generally comprised of the largest banks and financial institutions in the world, and also a lot of the medium-sized regional and super-regional banks as well. And in terms of my background, I worked at Accenture for a few years in their consulting practice, leading a lot of initiatives related to risk and the regulatory space as well, and also have background as a credit officer and enterprise risk manager, among other things. So excited to be here today. Really love the topic of data management. I think it's definitely not a new topic, but it's still a bit mysterious to a lot of folks. So excited to demystify it a bit.
Awesome. All right. Well, I have a bunch of questions for you, but for those that are tuning in, we are taking questions live and happy to address them as they come in. For those that are joining us right now, the topic is data management in financial services. And once again, this is Michael Ivie. So, Mike, the first question I have for you is, what is data management?
Okay, interesting question, and quite a loaded one actually at the same time. Data management means something different to a lot of different people across the organization and across different industries. But generally, when I think of data management, I think about the overall life cycle of data, basically from cradle to grave, from the time the data is created and ingested into your data ecosystem to the time it is ultimately retired or deleted or archived. And across that life cycle, there are a bunch of different steps that take place. So everything from the actual acquisition of the data to validating the data, storing it, protecting it, and processing it across all the different stakeholders, warehouses and hops across your data ecosystem. So definitely a lot of different ways to look at it and a lot of different vantage points. If you were to ask a data scientist or a quant what is data management,
Right.
They are going to approach it from a very different perspective than a business, someone in the business or front office who's probably thinking of more transaction and position data, customer data management. And also on the other side of the coin, you have your reporting teams, your finance teams that look at it more as your summary subledger data and your finance data. And so how's that mousetrap built, so to speak, and what's the supply chain for the data that ultimately gets reported in our financial statements or to regulators?
Got it. All right. Well, so how would you conceptualize the capabilities that kind of make up data management?
Okay, I think this is an important question, because how you conceptualize data management is really how you bring meaning to it, right? And at Phyton, we generally have 6 core capability areas that we highlight, and this is pretty standard aligned with the industry best practices around it. So you'll find organizations like DAMA, the Data Management Association, or the Enterprise Data Management Council that have reference capability areas or domains that they align within the data management universe. For us, our 6 include data governance, data quality, data architecture, data security, and of course master data, metadata, reference data management, and of course data architecture as well. And so within each of these domain capabilities come a whole set of considerations across people, processes, and technology. And if we were to go one by one, we could probably speak all day about all these different capabilities and sub-capabilities within them. But within the data governance domain, we're really talking about the human element or the human organization aspect that's required to manage this whole life cycle of data that we're talking about across all of the other domains or capabilities that we mentioned. The other ones we mentioned, like data structure, for instance, is really the definition of the data. And on the data architecture side, this very much, a lot of folks think of this as as an IT function, but we're really looking at the storage and movement and retrieval of data across this data ecosystem or the data supply chain. And my favorite and arguably probably the most difficult one to master is the data quality side.
Your favorite? Why is it your favorite?
My favorite and least favorite, right? Because if you are a end consumer of data in a modern banking institution today, data quality is a nightmare for you. Okay. Even the best banks on the street are still far off from getting where they want to be with managing data quality. Mm-hmm. So data quality really refers to the accuracy and completeness of your data, which seems simple. You want the correct data in the right place at the right time.
What's so difficult about that?
Well, you know, if you just simplify it to individual transactions in a simplified business model, it might seem easier to manage. But when you look at these large multinational organizations that are really the heritage of a series of mergers and acquisitions and changes in products and introduction of new systems, all this different change over time creates a lot of complexity that becomes difficult to manage over time. And I think in financial services in particular, we were really bad for a few decades at investing in our infrastructure, in our people and processes and technology to make sure that we build the right culture around data. And you know, generally when we talk about people, process, and technology for data management, when we talk about people, we actually generally say people and culture. Because even if you have all the right roles and responsibilities defined and people in the right seats, you have all the policies and procedures defined, you have all the right committees and org structures, you've deployed architecture teams and regulatory remediation teams. If you haven't built the right culture around how your organization thinks about data, then you're kind of setting yourself up for failure. And generally what you'll see is a hype cycle around data management. So the first couple of years of the program, everyone's excited, everybody's learning new things. You know, a lot of the business sponsors and stakeholders in the program see conceptual value in the program.
They're all on board in the beginning, right?
Exactly. They don't necessarily want to write the check to hire the people and to buy the systems needed to fix it, but they certainly appreciate the challenge of having bad data quality, and that it's a big undertaking to fix it. And also that it certainly helps that the regulators are standing there with the stick, kind of drawing a line in the sand saying, get past this line by this date, or we're going to have some issues. So that helps the conversation along.
Right, great. All right, so thank you for that awesome overview. We do have some questions that came in. One from Lucas Santoro, he asked that, can you introduce us to career paths in data management? So what are some careers that you'll see in that space?
Yeah, so across all these capability areas, there's a lot of work that has to be done to really build kind of a business as usual or BAU capability around it. So how do you start to define the universe around these capability areas and start to do work on it, right? So generally this concept of a critical data element is kind of the most fundamental the attribute or thing you need to understand in data management, because when we can identify what our critical data is to our firm and then go through exercises of decomposing that critical data, so tracing it back through the different hops in our ecosystem to the point of origination or where the data was ingested or created, you'll realize very quickly that how much complexity there is there with the different transformations that happen to the data, the different business rules that need to be captured and understood and managed. So that's one big opportunity, I think, for folks entering the profession is getting good at both on the kind of the PM business analyst side of being able to engage with stakeholders all the way from the reporting team or the finance team and trace all that data back through liaising with technology, liaising with the business and understanding what the requirements underlying the data are. So having that good project manager type skill set where you can manage all those different stakeholders and really trace the data. And as you get more technical in this vein of data management, you could be on the IT side or a business owned position that's that has that more technical slant where they're actually reading code and demystifying the code, right? Because a lot of times these business requirements for data in financial institutions aren't actually defined outside of, the code is the best documentation you can have for data, is something I hear oftentimes from technologists in an organization. But to business users, or when you're in a fire drill and you need to understand the transformations or hops of that data, that's not always the most efficient way to have your requirements documented. So.
All right, I have another great question from Akfat. He asks, what's the difference between IT governance and data governance in financial services?
Okay, so when we talk about data governance, we're really talking about the human element of managing all this stuff. And data governance is absolutely best owned by the business, owned and sponsored by the business, and enabled by IT. So IT certainly has a role in data governance. So IT's role, though, will be in whether it's on the IT architecture side or the data modeling side, whether physical or more logical, conceptual. IT is going to be an important catalyst to helping provide that insight into the flows of the data, providing the queries and extracts and transformations of the data to help all the different stakeholders across the organization understand how that data is used, acquired, and so on.
I have actually another great question that just came in from Sherwan. He asks, what's the biggest challenge faced by financial services institutions in data management? I can't wait to hear this one.
Well, today it depends on how you want to word it. I think usually it's from a regulatory standpoint, and so
right.
Regulations still are a significant challenge. There's a number of other challenges, whether they're from data security and data breaches perspective, or I would actually argue it's getting the culture right. So getting the momentum behind the program and then keeping it moving so that you continue to grow and enhance and iteratively evolve this, because there is no beginning, middle, and end to data management like there is when we talk about a project.
Right.
So for data management, there's not really a destination; it's a journey.
Right.
I think a lot of folks like to say. So how do organizations stay engaged and stay incented beyond just having a regulatory requirement to do so? So where does the rubber hit the road for this? I would say, getting back to the careers question also, data lineage is kind of it's also not a destination, it's more of a means to an end, but it's an exercise we go through when we're tracing data back from one point to another, and so it's a great skill set to have where you can, again, liaise with the business and technology, understand the requirements in those hops in the data, and banks are really bad at doing it, because if we do it and we just drop a Visio diagram of what it looks like today, as soon as you hit save on that document, your lineage is stale. But there are a number of emerging tools with capabilities that will help you, to some extent, evergreen your data lineage. There's always going to be a human management of your data lineage to ensure that it's kept current. A lot of, one thing that we might talk a little bit about today will be some of the roles and responsibilities in a data governance or data management program, which include data owners, data stewards, and things like data custodians and so on. But data owners are generally sit in the business, and they're the folks that are the senior level owners or sponsors for the data. They're the folks that are ultimately impacted the most if there's an issue with the data. And generally those are the folks that are delegating who the data stewards are within the organization, because the data steward is going to be more of the hands-on person that is involved in the day-to-day use and movement of that data. So they're going to be intimately involved in that data and very knowledgeable on it. So they're going to be able to help drive the definition of data, which sounds like an easy thing, defining data attributes.
Yeah.
And gets back to that concept of master data, metadata, and reference data management. But it is probably one of the top pain points for financial institutions. They're having a very difficult time of having a consistent management of master data across their organization.
Well, speaking of issues, Parimal Kotak asked if there's been resistance in financial institutions to going to the cloud, right?
I think several years ago, it almost, especially 10 years ago or so, it almost seemed absurd that financial institutions would consider going to the cloud. How do you
Right.
control and own and manage your data if it's not even on-prem? And I would say that's completely changed these days, and now most financial institutions, the larger they are especially, are kind of asking the question of why aren't we there yet? How fast can we get to the cloud or get our data put in a data lake or a flatter structure that will allow us to use it in different ways? And the technology is really catching up to enable this movement.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned data governance, and I'm not sure if data strategy, would you put that under data governance or not? Somebody asked the question of basically who's in charge of data strategy.
Yeah, that's a great question, and basically, if I had to pick a capability area, it's absolutely going to be the data governance component, and data governance is somewhat unique in that it's almost an umbrella across all the other capabilities that are required for an effective data management program. But generally, and happy to share some education and resources folks can utilize or access to get smarter on these topics. But generally, you're going to have a committee and council structure within an organization that will help manage and drive the decision-making process as it pertains to data management, and so the ideation of new policies and procedures and enhancements to this data ecosystem that underline the strategy, the data strategy for the organization, are certainly going to be driven and championed from the data governance group.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so who would you say are the key players that deal with data management, and kind of what are their roles?
So the key players within an organization are going to be typically, I think 10 years ago you didn't see too many folks with the title Chief Data Officer, and now pretty much every large organization and a lot of the medium-sized organizations have that role, that CDO in the organization. Kind of a similar conversation I think we had in the world of risk, where the concept of a CRO or Chief Risk Officer was something new, and now it's commonplace. Yeah. So the CDO generally is going to be the lead for the data office, and they're going to drive a lot of the priorities from top down for the organization. And the larger the organizations get, the more complex the ecosystem gets. And if we look at like the large multinationals or global banks, you'll see they have multiple lines of business spanning multiple geographies. Yep. And within those lines of business, multiple products. So there's a few different models you can deploy in looking at data management. Like generally, you have a centralized model where you have a data office that sets the standards for the organization, and that's it. Those are the rules of the road for the most part. And then you have a kind of a more decentralized model where it's up to the individual business units to manage and govern their data, and then a more federated model where it's centralized, but it's kind of more of a hub and spoke, and it's centralized. The policies and procedures for the enterprise are set. You have your common committee structure that all the subunits report into, right. But there is some freedom and flexibility left to the individual business lines to adopt the policies and standards as appropriate for their idiosyncratic characteristics of their group.
Right. So just going back quickly for the chief data officer role, is there a mandate or a regulation that requires, let's say, the big banks to have a chief data officer now, or no?
That's an interesting question. So on the regulatory front, there are, in particular, folks that are familiar with data management have probably heard of BCBS 239, the Principles for Effective Risk Data.
Wait, say that again. What is it?
BCBS 239. So BCBS is the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, and they similar folks probably heard of Basel III, Basel IV, the Basel Accords in general, and they published in January 2011 these 14 principles that basically outline 4 key areas around architecture and infrastructure, risk data aggregation, and risk reporting. and also some standards for supervisory bodies and the regulators. But
Right.
so on the regulatory side, I would say that's kind of the big driver for a lot of the work that's happening in the space, but they don't necessarily. You'll find that these principles aren't prescriptive, meaning they don't say letter of the law, step by step. This is what you have to do. This is how your program has to look. It's a principle-based guidance essentially that organizations kind of adopt and implement, aligned with general best practices of the industry, but also taking in considerations of where their organization's at today and how it's structured.
Interesting. All right. So another question from Shubhadeep says, do you face any kind of versioning issues while doing data management at scale, and how do you confront it? Basically, what tools do you use to address versioning?
So this probably should go back on that big challenge list, because a lot of MRAs and MRIs that organizations face are because of this exact point here. And usually what we say is we have challenges around having the single version of the truth, right? So if you have breaks,
golden source of data.
The golden source of data, exactly. A common front door, however we want to refer to it.
Yes.
And that's why we conduct data lineage, so we can ensure that there is a golden source or an authoritative source of data, and that we are using it consistently across the organization. But the reality is, what we find in many cases, there are breaks across that data lineage.
Mm-hmm.
And by break, we mean basically the data leaves the controlled environment,
Right.
and then maybe is re-entered into the control environment. And so, was that data enriched or transformed in any way? It's you're not sure. You're not sure what changes were made in that data, in that break. So it can result in different versions of the truth of data. Also, if you go upstream of the data, multiple people are consuming data at a data point upstream,
Right.
and then those transformations are happening downstream. You might find that one organization is representing potentially, this often happens with financial and regulatory filings. Regulators scrutinize the numbers and they realize that, well, you're saying your balance for this is this here, and in another spot on one of your other reports you're saying something else, and it's because the data has been managed inconsistently across the organization.
Yeah.
And so you have different versions of the truth, essentially, the data. So those are drives a lot of the big challenges that organizations have to get this stuff right.
All right. Well, Alejandro doesn't have a question. He just wanted to say hi. Hi, Alejandro.
Hi,
He
Alejandro.
just wanted to write a message. All right. So Roman asks, what about the role of global privacy compliance requirements, so such as GDPR? I know you love GDPR, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of our clients are the large foreign banking organizations, and GDPR certainly impacts everyone globally and is setting a higher standard that even folks that aren't as subject to it may indirectly be subject to it because of who they do business with, or who their customers are, or who their vendors are, and so on.
Yeah.
So most folks are kind of taking the best practice of trying to adopt it as much as they can. Lots of challenges and operational challenges, I'll say, that creates, which kind of creates more fuel for having effective data management. Because if you have a more concise and integrated ecosystem around your data and better controls in place, it will allow you to more effectively implement these requirements. And so probably a great topic for a whole other discussion on it, because the rabbit hole goes quite deep when we start talking about all the different requirements of data, whether it's customer data in particular and privacy requirements, and how data is anonymized, but at the same time having common identifiers so that you're able to still ensure that data is aggregated and the integrity of it is maintained as needed to meet the requirements of the organization.
Got it. All right, there's a question. It's a little long, but I still want to read it. 1 second.
Okay.
Spencer. All right, so Spencer says, many financial institutions are using 3 to 5 different BI tools, such as Tableau, Cognos. The word Tableau caught my attention, by the way. That's why I'm
Okay.
asking the question. MicroStrategy business objects. So what challenges do you see with managing so many business intelligence tools?
Yeah, and business intelligence can mean a lot of different things, and so you have your visualization tools like Tableau and Click that generally what we're seeing is some banks may have had different business units that adopted different ones, or some banks might have multiple within that business unit.
Right.
Banks are proactively trying to simplify their vendor landscape and run through vendor rationalizations and system rationalization so that they have a common platform across the firm. We had the same thing on the modeling side with R, Python, and SAS and so on. So that's always a never-ending challenge of organizations that they're aware of. There's always the effective sales side of the vendors, where the vendors have great relationships, and so it takes the discipline at the top of the house to really set the tone that we're going to try and identify best in class for what our needs are,
right,
and we're going to adopt it consistently. I think one important thing here is a wrong decision is better than no decision. So waffling on the idea and allowing all the different groups to have kind of wild west environment, having too much stuff going unchecked for too long can create lots of inconsistencies across the organization. So you might have great line level visualization happening in different business units on different tools, but as you start to try and aggregate that, it gets very difficult when things are written in different languages. You don't have common master data and reference data and metadata that's feeding into that analytical or performance-based data. I think is usually a lot of what we focus on a lot when we talk about data visualization and dashboards for internal consumption.
Right, and then Ronan had to add to that a high-level goal he thinks should be to standardize the tools and technologies, just to avoid that confusion. But I guess you're saying whatever meets the needs of the organization is what you should be going with.
Well, maybe in the short run it's not terrible to have discovery, but I would actually agree with Rohan that ultimately you do need to have a common mandate across the organization that this is what we're using. There can be one-off situations where it legitimately does not meet the business needs, and so something else would need to be considered. But if you have the right management committee structure in place, you should be able to escalate that through the proper channels,
right,
and get an override or approval to go a different direction as needed. But oftentimes what I find is people think that Click doesn't need the Tableau does, or vice versa.
right.
A lot of times you'll find that it's just an education point, or just maybe asking the question a different way, and you can still answer it with either tool.
Rodrigo adds to that and says that most challenging thing is finding the trusted source for all of those 3 to 5 tools, which I think you spoke about that before, that one version of truth. Because even though you're using, let's say, 5 different BI tools, as long as you're pulling from the same golden source, that should be okay.
Yeah, and it's easy to say that, golden source of data, and then everything's perfect.
Right.
But the reality is there's different timeliness and frequency of data that's required across the organization. Everything from real-time to near real-time to daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annual data. And so, when you're talking about the more timely stuff, a lot of times you're using production data to feed into it. And so there are adjustments that can happen that may not have been captured until after the source where you pulled the data from. So absolutely, that's a big challenge, and it's something that organizations really have to focus a lot in terms of defining access controls and user controls for the data, and really enforcing the adoption of all the data standards that the governance team and the data management team are championing.
Kathy also said hi. Hi, Kathy.
Hi, Kathy.
Good to see you here. There was another question from Stavros. What kind of measures do you get or take to acquire high quality data? So for banks, what do they do? How do they get high quality data?
Well, that's a tough question, right? In some cases, it's easier than others, but to really ensure that the data being reported at the end or leveraged at the end for decision-making purposes or whatever it is, the only way you can really ensure the data is of high quality is really to have a strong control environment, which usually gets back to that idea of having data quality rules documented and tested throughout all those different touch points or potential breaks or transformation points in the lineage chain of the data. So really building that solid control environment is the only way to really ensure it, other than what I think organizations have done today to make sure that what's getting reported externally or leveraged internally is correct, is just throwing an army of people at it to basically put eyeballs on numbers and do checks, which is a great effort to remediate an immediate problem, but longer term, not sustainable, not cost efficient, and shareholders are certainly fatigued of the enormous operational burden that creates. So how do you move towards a more integrated ecosystem and leverage better tools and technologies and kind of elevate your workforce from these painful kind of process-oriented, check the box, commoditized reviewer type roles to more of a career path, something that's interesting and exciting, where you're deriving insights and you're reviewing your data profiling exercises and the results from that, and continuing to actually drive the improvement of your control environment.
Thank you. All right, next question comes from Roderick. So Power BI, ClickView, or Tableau, what's the best for beginners in terms of community, market, job, and learning curve? Before you start,
I was about to say
Tableau. I think most people know I love Tableau, but I've actually used Power BI and Click in recent years, months, and I think they're pretty much the same. They all serve a very similar purpose, and I think it depends on kind of whatever you get started with. That's probably where you're gonna end up using, unless you go to another organization and they have a different software, and then you're just gonna learn that. But I think once you learn one, it's fairly simple to get caught up to using other tools if you needed to. In terms of community, I think Tableau has a pretty good community. I think that's what helped me learn it so quickly when I was a beginner. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. One thing I love about all these tools and a lot of the other tools in the data management ecosystem, like Calibra and Informatica, and Calibra in particular, a lot of the tools are actually designed with the business user in mind. So someone with Excel or semi-advanced Excel level capabilities or IT proficiency can pick up these tools and relatively intuitively learn how to start using those tools. Obviously there's a learning curve and there's always good, better, best, but you can get to good very quickly with all these tools.
Yeah.
You're
I agree with that. I think it's a little tricky though, because though you can get really good really quickly, I think there's an issue kind of where people think they know what they're doing and they can build a chart, in 2 seconds, but a lot of times they're not sure kind of what does it really mean or what's the data that's underlying that. That's a whole nother topic for another session, but yeah, great question there.
Yeah, not knowing what you don't know can over time become a humbling exercise, I think, and a big pain point.
Yes. All right, question from Imrus. What's the advice on governing, What's the advice on governing multiple data sources where different metadata exists and there's no data quality really processes in place? How do you build that process if there are no data quality tools available?
Okay, so the whole concept of effective master data management is a difficult concept for organizations to get right. And generally there is no big bang answer to it. So there is no, okay, we're going to do this project and then everything's going to be perfect. So it gets back to what we were talking about before about iterative enhancements to get better over time. And so I would say that you have to kind of break it down like you would a project and like you would build a roadmap into digestible chunks. And I always am a big champion of running with proofs of concepts to get the buy-in and to also fail early, make your mistakes with a smaller sample size. But figure out what works for you and your organization, make your mistakes early, and then slowly, based on materiality, start to add in, expand the scope of how you're rolling that out. So within master data, if we're talking about like reference data, or specifically how we define like customer data and transaction and position data and things like that. Those are always great places to start.
Right.
And generally, when we talk about like metadata and also data dictionaries and business glossaries, which are very different things. So when we're talking about more technical definition of data versus a business definition of data, writing data definitions is actually much harder than folks think, because you need an unambiguous definition of what a customer is that's applicable across an enterprise. And I've seen highly paid executives at some of the largest organizations in the world spend multiple months just asking a few basic questions like, what is a customer, what is a trade, what is a party,
right.
Basic questions like that, and having difficulty or even reaching consensus in one meeting and then falling out of consensus on what was previously agreed on. So this is where it gets back to having really solid project managers that can help drive the process, and having a good PMO mentality for setting goals and milestones, having a well-articulated roadmap with milestones that you want to hit, and forcefully pushing through it and getting through things. Knowing when to see the forest from the trees and prioritize and deprioritize things. You're never going to get 100% right on things.
Right.
So if you can figure out the 20% of decisions or questions or fixes that need to happen that solve for 80% of your challenges, then you're doing really well. And
that 80-20 rule.
Exactly.
Spencer asked if we can re-watch this after it ends. Yes, you can re-watch it. It's going to be on LinkedIn, on my profile. You can watch it over and over again, as I'm sure you'd want to. Next question. Actually, I'm not sure if it's a question, but Roman has a statement. In an org culture, level data silos tend to persist and counter data science efforts in order to stay on top of information flow and content. Any thoughts on data silos in an organization? Is that another challenge in financial services?
Yeah, absolutely. I think silos within businesses are always a challenge. We've gone through it in pretty much every other practice area, like risk. Well, if you're looking at credit risk, market, liquidity, operations risk,
right.
all in a silo, it's difficult to roll that risk up and look at your overall enterprise risk profile, risk appetite, and risk framework, and your risk exposures, and really hard for the board to make good decisions. And the same thing happens with data.
Yeah.
You need a way to allow the business still conduct their business on a day-to-day business basis, but at the same time there has to be a consistent use and definition of data across the organization. So yeah, I agree. It's definitely a topic we could spend days on. But how do you break up silos? And it gets back to that point we made about people and culture, and the central data office and then the federated units within the lines of business. They can have all the best policies and procedures and council structures with the right stakeholder engagement, but if we're not really kind of creating that culture of everyone as a data manager in an organization, so many times what we'll see is folks in the front line, in the front office, are creating data and they're just throwing it over the fence. They don't fully understand who's consuming it downstream.
What they need it for, who's going to use it, right?
Exactly.
Who cares? I'm just doing my job.
And the folks consuming it downstream, likewise, aren't proactively understanding where the source of that data is, how that data is properly defined, what the requirements are, and limitations of that data that may exist. So it gets back to creating that culture, really driving the adoption of the data management, data governance policies and procedures and best practices. And as you start to adopt this stuff, you can focus on that 80-20 concept. Then you can start to get into more nuanced, difficult to handle concepts. And early on, it may be easier to ring fence some of the silos and just note it as a limitation downstream.
Let them do what they're doing for a while.
Yeah, and eventually run your proofs of concept. Use that as a vehicle to get those stakeholders engaged, and engage some of the trade organizations that offer training and development, and your consulting firm partners, and publicly available resources like Kate's channel and so on that help bring resources to you so you can educate your folks for the next 10 years of banking and data management.
Right. And actually, on your point on stakeholders, Shivam had a question. What is your advice on working with business stakeholders? I'm sure that's a tough one. Right?
So this is an interesting one. I think the industry as a whole has gotten a little bit better at working with business stakeholders. Part of it's been education of the business stakeholders themselves,
right.
And also just recognizing that a business stakeholder does not want to be engaged by someone from IT that does not speak their language, right? And
yeah.
So IT may not know how to ask the right questions, and the business generally will not know how to ask the right questions of IT. So a lot of times having a PMO function or really good BAs that are well versed on the business side, they speak that common language,
right.
And they understand the technology, somebody to fill that gap and really go through and run it like a project, actually go through and play that middleman throughout that process helps a lot with engaging the business.
Yeah, I was going to say, how do we bridge that gap? I'm sure that's a tough one, and it, I guess, goes back to increasing the data literacy at the business and management level. But are you seeing the clients that you're working with in this industry, are you seeing them doing anything specific to try to enhance the understanding of data, from the business side of things?
Cultures vary a lot from organization to organization and even business line to business line. Like investment banking versus, on the retail side and credit cards or loans or whatnot, all have different cultures, and certain folks in the organization are going to be like sponges. They're just looking to learn and get educated and move across multifunctional groups within the organization. And other folks want to come in, do their job, and go home.
Right.
So, it's a mixed bag in all organizations, so you kind of have to play to everyone. And then we have the whole debate about, the older school baby boomer style of working versus how millennials like to work. So there's a lot of considerations around culture that, again, come into play here. But there's the mandatory annual or other periodic training that organizations force. I think a lot of times that stuff kind of turns into just get it done, so you don't get yelled at by your manager after a
right.
couple notifications. But organizations are getting better at making that training more informative and more interesting, so folks engage with it more and actually learn something from it. But I would say the end business users actually participating in those proofs of concept that are championed by the data office and the data governance teams, actually engaging and participating in those programs is the best way to learn.
Right.
And so when the opportunity comes, raise your hand in your group to say, well, I want to work with the data quality guys in defining those requirements for the data, and at the same time, go read your policies and your procedures. Go read your company's 10K. There's a wealth of information at your fingertips.
Yeah, I remember when I was, I spent more time in financial services, the issue was who's going to learn the new language, right? So is the business going to learn the data language, or I think more times than not, it's the data team that has to learn the business language.
Absolutely, because when we talk about a data team, a lot of times we are talking about a more fluid team that wears a lot of different hats in the organization. Maybe there's a BAU capacity to it, like they run certain reports on a recurring periodic basis, or maybe, do we have a...
No, I think we're still good.
Okay. So, I think business savvy is kind of a generational thing that is changing over time. So the business savvy of the technology ecosystem and the technology landscape is helping bridge that gap in that conversation. So I would say it's actually more the business learning IT's language, but also having those middlemen, just let's make it easier. Let's have somebody to hold hands throughout those conversations. So let's have those data analysts or versatile BAs. I like to think of them as they kind of wear this quasi PM hat. They're really good at engaging these stakeholders and holding hands and just driving things to completion.
Great. Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time. I think we're right up at the 45-minute mark, so I'd like to wrap it up and just say again how happy I am to be going live here with LinkedIn, and to thank Michael for joining me here from Phyton. Thank you so much. I think, we had a lot of great comments, a great discussion, and I think people really got a lot of value out of this, so thank you again.
Absolutely. Happy to be here going live on LinkedIn with you, Kate.
All right. Bye.
Take care, everyone.